Where did your grandfather come from?
Ireland. No, I'm sorry. He was born in Baltimore, Maryland in 1870.
And so trace me back to the actual Ireland family coming over. Who is that?
My great-grandfather and great-grandmother came somewhere in the late 1860s, married apparently here, and bought a farm immediately behind St. Agnes Hospital in Baltimore. In fact, half of the property was in Baltimore City and the other half was in Baltimore County. And they established a dairy farm known at the time as Alderney Dairy. In the mid-1990s, my grandfather took over the farm, was unfortunately, he died in 1909 of a disease called erysipelas, which is a disease that swine producers know well.
And it's gotten from swine?
No, the bacteria is susceptible to humans and other species, but erysipelas in agriculture for years was a serious disease in swine.
Your grandfather was young?
He was 30. He was 39 when he died.
That's a shame. So he gave birth to
My father,
we're going to call your father, what's his first name?
John C. O'Mara.
So John was living where? Was he on a farm?
He grew up on the dairy farm in the 1960s into the 20s. The dairy farm, for various reasons, fell into disrepair, was being managed poorly at the time, and my recollection is that the Western Maryland dairy assumed what assets that they had, and that was basically the end of the dairy. It lasted approximately 50 years.
So your dad decided to do what then?
My dad, at that time, was in his teens. He went to high school for 3 years. Economic times were very difficult. He, in 1927, went to work for a Chevrolet dealer, Anderson Chevrolet, in Baltimore. And for 58 years, he sold automobiles, including here in Howard County.
So then, how did we get to the farm that I learned about that's currently off of 144?
It was on 144.
How did that come about?
My dad always had an interest in agriculture. He never really was able to have a clean breakaway. And when I was a child, growing up in Catonsville, he never was without horses. When I was 2 years old, I had a pony, and we kept them in various places, friends and places that he rented. And in fact, one of the most common places, or the long-term places, is with the property where Catonsville High School was presently, and it was an old established estate called the Lerman Estate, and very historical. And the old barn that we used, frankly, is still there. But in 1952, he came across this piece of property in Howard County on 144 west of Marriageville Road, and decided to buy it. And I was the oldest of 6, and we all, in April of 1952, we moved there. And there more or less developed what interest I had in agriculture, kind of started at that point.
What was the farm used for before your dad bought
it? It was owned by a man who owned a bar in Sykesville. And he apparently, during the 40s, had card gambling going on in the basement of the first floor of this house. I don't think the man ever lived there, from what I understand. When we bought the place, we spent many weekends cleaning empty beer bottles and liquor bottles and whatever out of a side window that apparently these were just thrown out of when they were finished with them. But and then the house, of course, was redone, so my mother was willing to bring her family here.
So you had how many siblings?
I had 5 siblings.
So 6 of you total?
Yes.
And you were the oldest?
I'm the oldest.
Break it down to boys and girls.
4 boys, 2 girls.
Okay. So Mom put some heavy demands on your dad to get that house ready where it was acceptable, huh?
Very heavy.
I'm glad it got acceptable.
One quickie that might be amusing is that my grandfather, my mother's father, was in the fuel oil business, coal business. Her family had been in the coal business since the early 1900s. And when it was announced that we were moving to Howard County, my grandfather was very upset because he, frankly, wasn't sure where Howard County was at the time, and or wasn't clear. And my father wanted to put an oil burner in this house because the house did not have any heat. And that was one of Mother's criteria. It had to have central heating. And my grandfather made my father put a coal furnace in because he felt like the winters were going to be so bad that he was going to not be able to get an oil truck out to keep heat in the house for us. And so for years we shoveled coal, and it always was an amusing anecdote for the family.
Who did most of the shoveling?
Probably myself and my dad.
So that was a house that held everybody. It was sitting on a piece of property, a farm, and that was how big was this farm?
It was 75 acres.
And what else came along with it besides your house?
Well, it was one of the old barn. The farm, from the history we knew, started in the 1860s. The name escapes me, but the documents that we saw. And the barn, the old bank barn that was unfortunately has since been torn down, was probably in the 1890s to the 1900. Good, solid, very stable old barn.
What did you wind up putting in that barn? What did it get used for?
Well, we had our horses. Of course, they came with us. My father insisted on having a dairy cow to supply the milk because that's how he was going to save money, not buying milk for the family anymore of 6 kids. That was a Jersey cow, and I was the milker, morning and evening. We had some beef cattle. And we had, as we all kind of grew up and got assimilated, all of us had 4-H projects that either included, for the most part, it was swine, and I think my brother, one of my younger brothers, had a calf or 2 or a steer. I had swine, a Hampshire boar.
Many?
No, I think I had about 2 or 3.
They were all the same breed?
They were Hampshire hogs. In fact, Mr. Yeager, Charlie Yeager's father, bought my boar after I showed him at the Howard County Fair in 1954 or 55, somewhere along that line, if my memory serves.
So along came the horses. From where to this new farm? Where were the horses?
The horses at the time we moved were on Foxhall Farm, which was owned by a physician by the name of Robert Healy. Foxhall Farm was on Rolling Road in Catonsville, outside of Catonsville. And when we moved here, Dad and Dr. Healy were very close friends, and we brought the horses to everybody, the Healy kids, 2 girls. We all kind of shared riding experiences and on the weekends and so on.
In those days, a horse had a problem. Something medically was going on. How was that addressed?
Depending on what was going on, for the most part, you worked your way through it, which was my experience. I think on occasion, my father had to call Dr. Ziegler, who was an iconic veterinarian in this area, in Baltimore, and as well as Howard County. And Dr. Ziegler did what needed to be done at the time, but we did not have, if my memory serves, we did not have any real issues with health issues with our animals in reflection. In the 40s and the 50s, there was minimal vaccination occurring, and of course all that has changed, but it really was never a serious problem.
I'm going to get back to that. Do you remember what age you were when your dad got that farm?
Yeah, I was about 15.
Okay. And were you going to school then?
Yes.
So tell me at 15, when you woke up in the morning, in the middle of the week, what your typical day was like. What did you do for that kind of day during the week at the age of 15 on this farm?
First thing I would do would be go down and milk the cow and bring the milk back up. My mother would, I would place the milk in a cooler container because my mother refused to feed her children anything but pasteurized milk. So we had a pasteurizer that was bought from Montgomery Ward, if I remember, and I think almost every day my mother pasteurized milk. Then, of course, caught the bus, went to school, came back, and depending on the time of year, there were always chores that my father had outlined for me that he wanted to see completed. And then, of course, late afternoon in the 5 to 6 range, we would do the afternoon or evening milking. And after that, it was homework. So I suppose that's probably the typical day.
What were some of the chores that you did around yearly?
Well, depending on what time of the year was, obviously, he bought himself a little John Deere tractor, an MT, it was called the day. And my father always had a large vegetable garden. And we would cut hay off some of the fields, and then the back part of the farm was all pasture. So from time to time, we would be clipping the pasture, keeping that in good condition. There would always be chores in or around the barn or the buildings that had to be attended to one degree or another. So I think, at least I did, because of my age, relative to my siblings, most of the work, just the kind of routine stuff fell on me.
What was some of the oldest equipment that you brought from the other farm to the new farm?
Well, we didn't bring any real equipment, my recollection. There was some old farm material, machinery. There was an old planter on the farm that probably had been used for a long time. I think when we attempted to get it working, it only worked for about an hour, and that was about it. And my father had a plow because even before we moved, we would have a garden someplace. At one time, it was in my grandparents' place. It was part of the old farm behind the hospital, a horse plow. So I've spent some time behind a one-horse plow, plowing or cultivating, and we still did that on our place because one horse, my father's horse was a combination riding horse and workhorse. He liked to have every opportunity to put old Duke to work.
Do you recall that this old corn planter sitting there still had a horse tongue on it?
Yes, it did. It was a 2-horse planter.
You never adapted it because you couldn't get it working?
Well, we had 2 horses on it, but I think it was just so mechanically beyond usability that it didn't, was not efficient.
Between the corn planter and the plow, you can't recall anything else? Any rakes?
Well, we had a rake. We had a dump rake. I think that's what the term was. And we did not have we did have a baler. We had a small McCormick Deering baler that took about 4 days to go around the field in 2 rows. It was a very slow process. Beyond the plow that was on, I think it was a 2-plow tractor that the MT carried at the time, is my recollection, and some equipment for that, which was basically new. That's, new for the time. That's about all we had. We didn't have anything particularly fancy.
Do you remember where the MT came from?
Yeah, Randsburg's.
And where was Randsburg's then?
Randsburg was right on Route 40, right on their old farm, Randsburg Farm. And in fact, the only other building that was nearby, again, my memory serves, was I think it was a Chrysler Plymouth dealer, a Wilkins Chrysler Plymouth or something like that. There was 2. Those buildings are both still there. Wilflax, that's a good one. Thank you. That's correct.
Jack, what was the difficult part of plowing with horses for you?
Slow. Didn't seem like you could get too much done in a reasonable period of time. But the vegetable garden that we had was probably 1.5 acres or something like that. So it wasn't a great chore. It was and then when the tractor came, then we were uptown, as the term would be called.
Before we get to the tractor, let's just
Stay with the horses.
Stay with the horses. I'm interested in this vegetable garden, or with the vegetable plot of land, since it's you said a little over 1 acre. You said.
A little over 1 acre, yeah.
That became useful for what?
Vegetable, obviously fresh vegetables. I mean, your corn, your tomatoes, your squash, all your summertime kind of things. And at that time, my mother was still inclined to, when there was enough to put up, as the term was used in those days, I guess, she did as much as that as she could. And so it provided a good source of fresh vegetables, certainly during the summer and to some extent during the cold months of the year.
When your mother put up her canned stuff, where did it go?
Where did it go?
For the winter?
The basement was one spot. Daddy had put up some shelves or whatever so she could load the shelves with her canned goods. Yeah.
Great.
When you plowed with horses, for those who don't know what that is, was that pleasure, or was it dangerous, or what?
No, I enjoyed it. I guess if I had a problem with it, it was so slow. And you could physically, the horse, my father used to complain a lot that Duke, the horse that we use, poor old Duke, he was, the term is maybe familiar to folks around horses, it was very shy. If a bird would come in and come nearby and kind of flit near him, he would go kind of berserk. And he'd have to be settled down, and then you'd have to get back to work again. And if there was a loud noise, which didn't happen probably very often, but that would be the same thing that he would react to. But he was not the most disciplined working horse, because you could just go and get it all done in a relative hurry. But
How about the weather during those times? So it could be difficult sometime with working the fields with the weather. Do you remember any kind of experiences where weather was really a big problem for you all?
not seriously. Oh, we did have some issues with snow. Our lane was between the two large fields in the front of the property, and the wind, it seemed like every time it snowed, the wind would fill that driveway in with about 3 or 4 feet, and there was a lot of difficulty managing to get out out and on the main roads again. That's when my dad bought us all he would find shovels that we never knew existed, and we were all out there, including my younger brothers, spending the better part of a day trying to dig out that lane.
Was it long?
It was long when you're shoveling 2 and 3 feet of snow. Yeah, it was probably, I would venture to say, about 150 to 200 yards long.
Good workout.
It was interesting.
So you mentioned at the house you had coal heat. And where were you getting your water in those early days when you were 15?
Oh, the water, the house did have water. We had a well just adjacent to the house that at one time was probably the water source, but the water was not an issue. The coal was only the one that one had to work.
Do you remember about when that house got electricity?
It had it when it was bought. It all had to be. The house was added on to because it wasn't enough room for this size family. I think, and all the rooms. I mean, it had one bath upstairs, then another bath downstairs was added, and it had a very small basement. Where, of course, the coal furnace was, and the coal bin, and these shelves for my mother's canned goods. And
remember where the coal came from? Maybe y'all could say something.
No, it came from my grandfather. My grandfather was a principal in Enterprise Fuel Company, which is one of the largest fuel companies in the city. And that was another reason why he didn't want to be sending trucks out this far. He thought we had moved to Ohio.
He got used to it, huh?
He did. Yeah, he did. I think it's much, when one gets older, the ease to get used to things becomes more difficult.
So I'm imagining with you that, let's give that grandfather a name. Did we already hear his name?
His name was Julius Knight.
Julius, okay. So Julius had the coal source. You all were worrying about an oil truck coming out and delivering.
He was. I don't think we were.
Oh, okay. Well, I bet you got a better deal on the coal than the oil, knowing that you knew the owner of the company.
Well, he delivered oil too. He didn't want the oil truck stuck in the snow. I think what his problem was, because again, that generation. Howard County, even if one lived in Baltimore, Howard County seemed a long distance. At the end of it was in the in the early 50s, Route 40 as we know it, stopped at St. John's Lane. You either went right or left, and then continued on Route 99 or Route 144, which was the most usable road further west. But for people in that generation in that period of time, it was an unknown, largely unknown.
Did you ever go down to Baltimore then?
I beg your pardon?
Did you ever go down to Baltimore then?
Oh, yeah. You mean when we lived here? Oh, sure, because we had to visit grandparents and that sort of friends and one thing or another. Oh, yeah.
How long was the ride usually?
Oh, gosh. Well, it wasn't all that long because, again, 40 was dual lane. It was, if my memory serves, dual lane to St. John's Lane. St. John's Lane and 144 and 99 were both fairly heavily traveled in those days. They were the main routes, after all. And, as one would go further west. And then it wasn't long in the middle 50s or so where 40 was then extended and to what we have today.
Did you or your family do any business or movies or anything in Ellicott City?
Not a great deal. My father at the time, when we moved out here, worked for Harry Parlett. It was a Dodge Plymouth dealer at Rogers Avenue and Route 40. And at those times, this was the middle 50s into the early 60s, the meeting place probably for Ellicott City and everybody in and around it that were so-called business people had lunch at Getz's restaurant. That building is no longer here, but that was a meeting spot for, I would suspect, many decades of the folks. And so there was a lot of interaction there. And but to go to the movies, no, I'm not I never was, and I still am not a moviegoer. So movies didn't attract me a great deal, nor my parents much.
Did you ever take advantage of the streetcar?
Only. Only before, I mean, I went to school before and I lived in Catonsville. I used a streetcar almost every day to go back and forth to school. But the one that went to Ellicott City, I'll be honest with you, I do not think I ever went from Catonsville to Ellicott City. I knew the route well, but I never had any reason to have to use it.
So when you were 15, 16, 17 on the farm, how was your dad raising money at that time?
He was selling automobiles.
But he worked the farm as well as sell automobiles?
Well, on the weekends and yes, yeah. What farming we did. We were not the most prominent farmers in town by any means of the imagination, but
how did he balance that all out?
It's a good question. I guess the only answer is when you like to do something, you find time to do it. And he was in what we used to call hog heaven when he was on the farm. My dad had the reputation, came from the family, his children as well as his wife, that he piddled a lot. And that meant that he would be working on about 5 or 6 projects at any given time, rarely completing any of the projects, but he had a lot going. He could always find something to do. I've inherited some of that characteristic myself because my wife complains about it all the time.
What described the things you liked about your dad?
Dad had a very sincere liking for people, hence his ability as a sales. Dad was a good salesman and was very successful in what he did. I thought he always had a strong feel for folks that were genuine versus those that were not genuine. We had this, would say, Daddy could pick a phony out in a minute, and I think that was probably true. But he had a genuine ability to have a good rapport with people and really like people and work with them. And of all his characteristics, I think probably that was one that kept him going. He was a good dad. I had a good mom and dad.
Did Dad pass away, or what was the transition from the farm?
Well, when the farm was bought by the county for the establishment of our famous dump on Marriageville Road, the farm was bought to add a boundary or a periphery around the dump, as well as were couple adjacent properties bought for the same reason. They remained on the farm for a few years, and then he bought a home in Woodbine, and they spent, if I recall, about 12 years there. And
where were you during that 12 years there?
Well, I was in school. I was in Maryland for in the late 50s. I was better known as by my peers as being one that had no idea what he was doing, and and that was true. I left Maryland in 1958, and I really defined something that I really wanted to do in life, and I had no idea at the time. Farming was only one of them, but I just didn't want to. I didn't have any real strong feeling that that's kind of where I wanted to spend my life. I ended up getting a job eventually with a company that sold drugs to veterinarians, and was given the territory, was placed in eastern Pennsylvania, and the company was Eli Lilly, and I spent a few years selling drugs to veterinarians. We got to know a number of them, and
what was your territory?
Eastern Pennsylvania. And so there was in the early 60s, that's where I was. And I then decided that why not go to veterinary school? And so I went back to Maryland and got my act together, and went to veterinary school in 1966 after I graduated from Maryland.
So you first had an interest in all sizes, or how did you approach that?
I think all sizes. I think when in veterinary school still, curriculum, you study all the species, pretty much. And my first experience when I started practice was in Pennsylvania because of a veterinarian that I knew well, and we had a good working relationship. It was a mixed practice, as it would be called at that time, and so we did a lot of dairy. His practice had a lot of dairy, and I did a lot of dairy in the 2 years I worked for him. My wife, I was married by that time, and then my wife and I, who was from Baltimore or Lutherville, we decided that we probably want to spend our life in Maryland, and we came back, and I worked for for 3 years, another mixed practice in Beltsville. We did a lot of equine in those days, actually, what I call backyard equine practice. It was, they were horses that folks had for entertainment. The horses for that spend times on track had their own clique of veterinarians. That was a full-time job. In 1975, I started my practice in Ellicott City.
Okay, before you got to Ellicott City and you went through all that time in Pennsylvania and then you came down to Beltsville, where was your dad and what was he doing?
Dad, by that time, by 1978, he, it was in the 1980s. He basically stopped. He was working for Mullenix Motors in Daisy at the time. They lived in Daisy, and he was retired and still planting his vegetable garden on his current home. When they were the late 80s, they moved to Charlestown, and he lived about 5 or 6 years there. And my mother lived probably about 12 years at Charlestown before she died.
So your dad, we're going to go back earlier for your dad. I'm curious about where he got his farming skills from.
They were from the farm of my, his father's, grandfather and father. It was from the history, word of mouth history. They had a fairly large farm, dairy farm for the times, and this was in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Anecdotally, they were the first dairy to deliver milk to the homes, as opposed to folks coming to the dairy to pick up their milk. And all this, because of their location, all this delivery process was in the periphery, just in the South Baltimore area.
And your dad helped with that process?
I'm sure he did when he was a young man. He was born in 1906, so he hit his teenagers, his teenage years in the time when the dairy was beginning to falter. And during the teens is when apparently it did. And then during the 20s, the family had been quite large, for various reasons, and economically things became very difficult. And it was the reason, of course, one of the reasons why he did not finish high school. He went only to the third year, as I mentioned, and then went to work because, frankly, he needed to make money to give to my grandmother to help feed everybody else.
What was the size of the family then?
Well, the size of the family was quite large. There was a lot of my grandfather had, great-grandfather had 9 children. And my great-grandfather and great-grandmother had 9 children, 4 of which died very young, relatively young in age. The others, with the exception of one, had fairly large families. And I would say that dysfunctionality was not rare in our family in terms of making a living in one thing or another. And so at various times, my grandmother ended up with nieces and nephews that ended up at her home because it was the old family home that my grandfather had built, and she had to respond to, or that's where they had to come to get clothes and shelter and hopefully a decent day's meal. times were tough for my family in the O'Mara side in the 20s and early 30s.
That was during the Depression, wasn't it?
Yes, well, Depression was it what, 27 to arguably well into the 30s, yes.
But you struggled through it, Jack.
Well, I think all families do. Nothing's easy.
So let's talk about the times you spent with that first tractor. Now, I'm pretty sure after your frustrations that you had with Duke, that you were pretty happy to have a tractor. Tell me about that.
I was happy as a pig in you know what, as they say. It was just we were able to get a lot of work done in a what I consider to be an efficient way, and on our little plot of land, really just getting the hay up for the animals, horses and beef cattle, was a project that that we took a good bit of our time at the various times of harvest. But tractor was that little tractor was a very useful tool. It really was. It ended up with my younger brother who did farm on the Eastern Shore. And then he ultimately sold it to a family who restored it, as he told me. So apparently that tractor is still around. I sometimes think I'd like to look it up and buy it again, but my wife says not in her lifetime.
How about the times you had to hook things up to it? What were you hooking up to the tractor?
Mower, various manure spreaders, the plow, hay rake. Of course, it pulled the baler. I guess that pretty much was its main characteristics or the main requirements, all of which it performed with a great deal of efficiency. But it had the interesting part about it, all the old John Deeres at that time had a horizontal engine and had a kind of the old put thing. Well, this one had a vertical engine. I think if I recall, it was only 2 cylinders, but it was because it was a smaller tractor than the larger versions. But it still had the put sound to it, which was nostalgic in my view. But and of course it was implemented. Ultimately, my father did buy a plow for it. There we helped clean our snow out, and that snow was still boggles my mind when we had to clean that darn stuff out in order to get mobile again.
Did you, when you got the chance, did you get to operate all that equipment you described?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Would you consider yourself okay at it or a master at it?
I was very good at it.
So you got exposed to a lot of animals early in your life. And I think that might have influenced you, even though you don't quite understand it yourself, when you decided to get into the veterinarian profession. Do you see a relationship between that yourself?
Yeah, I do. And one was that I was, from the get-go, I was always very comfortable around animals. And that included the full range. I mean, I had a pony when I was 2. And I rode the pony, they tell me, when I was 2 and 3. So obviously I was being led, but and we always had a dog, no matter where we were. The dog in those days, for the most part, lived outside. That doesn't happen anymore to speak of, but So I've always been very comfortable around animals, and that does come. I never thought of it, but it does come from one's early experience, and and I was very fortunate that, frankly, the way things turned out for me, that I mean, I can't imagine doing anything other, in hindsight, than I was lucky enough to be a veterinarian.
In those days, on the farm, what did your dog eat?
Scraps and leftovers, I think. Believe it or not, yeah, I think that's probably most of it. I'm not sure my father would ever buy dog food. Dog food was what was kind of left over. And a lot of that in those days, it was, you may not, but when one had a meat for a dinner or whenever, there was always a large layer of fat. Up until about the mid-60s, just about every steak one would buy, it would probably have an inch of fat around it that would be cut off by some and eaten by others. But if the dog was around, the dogs would get it. And unfortunately, now that I've been through 40 years of practice, fat killed a lot of dogs, an awful lot of dogs.
Yeah, we fed our dog chicken bones and ham.
Sure.
Bones.
Oh yeah. And those chicken bones had some age on it. Today's chicken bone is what, 6 weeks old, and you and I could probably chew on chicken bones without an issue. Chicken's not as tasty as it once was, though, I must add.
Did you have chickens on the farm?
We had chickens. We had for eggs and for the occasional chicken dinner. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
How many?
Oh, I think we had. Well, we'd buy the chicks. I guess 50 at a time, and some Dad would keep it for for the laying hens, and the others we would eat.
I noticed that when you have a large garden, or your whatever we're going to describe it as, your food sources, that it gets grown for you, but it turns out that a lot of other environments seem to like the vegetables as well. How was that controlled in those early days?
I'm sorry. I'm not sure I understand exactly.
Okay. So you're back at the garden,
Right.
or the vegetable plot. Your dad's growing it, you're helping, you're plowing it, you're harvesting it, mom's putting it away. And during that growing time, though,
Oh, okay.
was it just an open field situation? How did you control the other population who seemed to be interested in your vegetables too? Let's call them the varmints.
They were never, frankly, never a problem that I can recall in terms of, you mean destructive of the garden? I can't, in my recollection, recall any situation in those days. In those days, deer was not an issue. Deer, I mean, I can imagine now, I'm not, I don't know this from personal knowledge, but the deer population has become so desperate that we have, that I can imagine people that I have a flower garden where I live, and they decimate a lot of my flowers. So I gather they could do it for a vegetable garden as well, new one. But in those days, I frankly do not recall ever really having an issue where there was any kind of concern along those lines.
You had groundhogs?
Occasional, but I don't think they ever really were a problem. They were in the back fields, a few of them, from time to time. But
So, Jack, when you were doing, you came down here and you got together with your wife, and your business was then operating, was it near Ellicott City, did you say?
Yeah, just outside of Ellicott City, yeah. Yes.
In your house, or you have?
No, no, I rented a building which was known as, it's St. John's Lane and Old Frederick, Frederick Road is where the practice is.
Uh-huh.
It was a building there that I rented and then bought about 3 years later and expanded in 1990.
So tell me when you were living there outside of Ellicott City and running this business, what a typical, how your route worked. What was it typically, how you circulated in servicing the animals amongst the farms?
Well, when I first moved and opened my practice, I think the only farm client I had, and I did this only frankly because a number of reasons, was the cows at Duregan Manor. Bill Powell, who was running Duregan Manor at the time, is a close friend, and in fact is my wife's first cousin. I knew Bill well before I knew my wife, but I did some work for the cows on Duregan for a short period of time, but veterinary medicine in Howard County in the mid-70s was in the state of rapid change. And I had to make a decision in terms of where we were going to go from a practice point of view. What was the most sensible and efficient way to go? And so I decided early on that the large animal business was something that I was not going to pursue. And it was a decision that, frankly, it turned out to be the right one, but it was veterinary medicine, as agriculture has in the last two generations, particularly in this area, has gone from one extreme to the other. And in fact, veterinary medicine in agriculture now, I think, is in a very difficult spot because of the changes in agriculture and, frankly, the changes in our profession as well. So it's one has to change. One has to react to changes if they're going to survive, and. So it always is interesting what one has to do and how you proceed.
Can you give me a specific comparison?
Comparison of?
Through the changes from early days to recently.
Well, I'll give you some examples. As far as I could speak knowledgeably about veterinary medicine as it relates to agriculture. When you as we all know, the farming in the 1950s, just 60 and 70 years ago, this county was, for all practical purposes, totally agriculture from an economic point of view. I don't know what the number is today, but it has to be in the single digits. I think this is happening. This has happened certainly on the East Coast, all over the country. We got what we have today in agriculture, and to some extent, with just dairy farms. The dairy, as I understand it, is concentrating in just a few states, Texas being one of them. And as it relates to the subject that you just referred to. These large corporate dairy farms that I understand can have tens of thousands of dairy cattle do not, their veterinary service is performed by veterinarians that they hire, many of them from outside this country. Mexico, I understand, is one of them, which is fine, but when a veterinarian goes to work for a corporation and practices for the corporation, he or she does not have to be licensed. You can just go from, and that's just kind of the way the system is. And so what it means is that an individual practice, a small practice, relatively of 2 or 3 veterinarians or whatever it is not, there's not many opportunities out there to make a living. And so while there are still some very good dairy practices in this state of Maryland, they are becoming less and less as time goes on. And I don't see where that trend will not continue, given the growth of what we've seen in the last generation or so.
I think you've done an excellent job, by the way. You were a little worried when we started out that you might not have much to say, but boy, you've communicated so much.
Well, I think you're being kind.
I'm being truthful. Let's go back just to a couple little questions, okay?
Sure.
I know you had a big family. 6 is pretty big. When you were living on the farm in your teens, and you were the oldest, did your brothers and sisters look up to you for advice or learning?
Probably not. I'm being facetious, but I think to some extent, families, if there is a solid family structure, and I'm a believer in what I'm a believer in what one would call life balance. If one's life is balanced, where you don't have these wide swings, but you always have swings, but relatively small swings, and good stability within a given family, we all learn from one another. I learned as much from them as probably they learned from me. And we're very lucky in that I'm almost 80, and the rest of it, I think my youngest sister is 65. And we still, as a family, while we are in various parts around, we're not all, I'm the only one that lives in Harris County. We all see one another reasonably frequently and are close. So we've been very lucky, and I think along those lines. I'm not sure that answered the question, but...
So, I want to get an idea when you were living on the farm and you were helping with plowing and you were helping with harvesting, you were helping with growing, and you were still there and you were in your teens in those early days. What was a typical Sunday like for you?
Sunday? Huh? Well, I was raised in a Catholic family, so the first thing we all did was go to church. And in those days, for those of us that recall, there was a institution called Woodstock College that was right over the other side of the river into Baltimore County, and at that time, Woodstock College was the theological seminary for the Jesuit order. And my siblings, basically, after we moved here, attended school in the parish known as St. Alphonsus. And the seminarians, many of the seminarians would spend some time over in the grammar school. And to some extent, some of the seminarians became fairly friendly with my siblings and my parents. 2 or 3 of them loved horses. And frankly, many Sundays, 1 or 2 would be there. This is said with somewhat tongue-in-cheek. Some would come to our house, ride the horses because it was recreation and one thing or another. And my mother thought it was wonderful that these young men and she would always have a night, would be there, and she would always have a nice Sunday dinner. So we all ate pretty well Sunday evenings when there was a visit from one of the seminarians. So frankly, that was a good bit of our, it wasn't every Sunday by a long shot, but it was a lot of Sundays. And it was educational for all of us. These folks, by and large, were very smart people, very highly educated, and it was a good learning, again, a good learning experience for us, I think. I guess that's probably the most memorable Sunday, if you will. Sundays in those days, contrary to today, in my experience, were truly somewhat of a day of rest. I can remember that businesses would be proud of the fact that they were not open on Sunday. Now, if you're closed on Sunday, you're out of business. So we're living in a different world.
Very good. You have anything, Art?
Do you remember, Jack, if they had mass both in St. Alphonsus and in the seminary?
Well, they had in the seminary, but it was not, to my knowledge, it was not open to the public. Many of the old St. Alphonsus church is not there. It's been torn down. There's a newer one up on the hill, as I understand it. But it was many times when the seminary was some of the priests, not the seminarians, that were at the college would come down and say mass there to help the pastor out and that sort of thing. And and at the time, I'm not familiar with it so much now. The folks that would come down, there were a number of very highly regarded theologians that lived at Woodstock at the time. One was a man by the name of Avery Dulles, Father Avery Dulles, who was John Foster Dulles' brother, a renowned theologian in the Jesuit seminary, or Jesuit order. And another one was a memory of a man by the name of Gustav Weigel, who apparently was highly regarded at the time as being one of the top theologians in the world. Both men, I was an altar boy in those days, and both men I served mass with. It was kind of overwhelming at the time, knowing these gentlemen's reputation at the time, and it was, and you get that, you get that out in the country. You don't. It was kind of unique. It really was.
So those were your choices of the extensions of what your dad, I think you phrased it, not phony people. There was another name.
Well, genuine, or I guess we had the genuines too. Daddy, my father was. I used the word phony, and I guess maybe that's a little bit too broad, but he wasn't much for the. Well, I think we all understand this. While we're all a little crazy in our own right, but there is a balance there, and he knew a good guy and a new gal when he saw it. Somebody that one could trust. He had a good sense for that.
And did you use that in your life?
I think I've been lucky enough to have that, yes.
I thought so. This is a wild question. Since you've had farming experience in your blood, it would be fair to say that, wouldn't it, Jack?
Oh, I think so. Yes.
I got two questions for you. Next to last. So, growing up, what did you used to do a lot on March 17th?
Have corned beef and cabbage, I guess. It's funny you say that because I've always while I'm very proud of my Irish heritage, I got a lot of German in me as well. I never was comfortable with all the Irish hoo-ha, wear the green and one thing or another. In fact, I recall a number of times, maybe coming down, going to school, whatever, and my mother said, well, aren't you going to wear green today? And I said, no, I'm not going to wear green today. If people can't tell I'm Irish, then I'm not going to need the green for that. But we didn't make much of it, other than the old corned beef and cabbage routine. I think we even had some this, my wife, fortunately, who is all German, not all German, but she acts German, but she fortunately likes corned beef, so we had a very good corned beef this year, as we do every year.
Do you ever get down much to the Howard County Fair?
I've been there for a couple of years. I've enjoyed it. The recent times I've been there, and it's been a couple of years now because of timing and one thing or another. My grandchildren, we've taken my grandchildren there a number of times over the years, and in the recent years. But and I remember the days when we were building. I helped carry the lumber and one thing or another for the first two buildings over there. I remember well.
So Jack, you're walking around the fairgrounds, and a young guy comes up to you and he says, I heard that you did some farming in your life. Could you give me some advice about, should I go into farming?
I have to think about that. It's a serious question. I would say yes, only if, but to be honest, I think to have a sustainable agriculture experience, I don't think it's a viable likelihood in this environment here. I have some good friends, close friends, people that we all know, whose sons would like to, but I just, in my vision, I do not see where economically it can support itself. And I know there's a tremendous amount of effort to kind of go into niche agriculture and that kind of thing. And I'm not so sure that is for a short while viable. But as we move, where the population has become so dense, I mean, economically, it's just a very, very difficult thing to do. And we've already seen the expansion of, or the movement of agriculture. The Eastern Shore still has some plenty of open land, and in Western Maryland. But when can you drive? I'll give you a quick example. I drove last week to Charleston, South Carolina. It's over 500 miles. Most of the trip was on Route 95. Route 95 cut through, if it's cutting through anything, it's cutting through farmland. I can count on one hand, and I do this, I make this trip annually as a rule. I could count on one hand the number of farms that off in the vision from 95 that I could see cattle grazing. One hand in 500 miles through a lot of agriculture, land. That tells me something. And so agriculture it's always been tough. It's been tough, and that's why we have so many people that lived, have made their living in agriculture. They're good, tough folks, and but I don't know that any of them would say it was easy. And it's just going to become much more difficult and much more economically challenging, I think, in areas like this. I think that's probably the best I can say at the moment.
Excellent, excellent. Anything else?
Regrettably, I must say regrettably, but that's, one has to see reality.
Well, you're not the first that's discussed that.
Yeah.
Anything else you want to add to this?
Well, I guess I certainly could appreciate the opportunity, but hopefully in the future you can pick up, you can have somebody better than I. So I think
Well, there's only two people better than you, Jack, so I don't know whether we'll get them or not.